and just enough to put a little psalms and hymns and spiritual songs in our hearts as we head into the holiday season. But we'll be in Psalm 50 here, and the word thanksgiving is found in the book of Psalms 7 times. And the first appearance of the word, now there's many other similar phrases, the giving of thanks. Thanks is found all throughout the Psalms, but the word thanksgiving in particular 7 times. And the first one we saw Sunday night, that was Psalm 26. I will publish with the voice of thanksgiving and tell of thy wondrous works. The one that we'll see, the second one is what we'll see here tonight in Psalm 50. It's a psalm of Asaph. There are 12 psalms associated with Asaph. Asaph was the choir director at the tabernacle during the time of David. And there are 12 psalms that are considered psalms of Asaph. That means he either wrote them, or in some cases they were already written, maybe by David, and delivered to him to sing. And Psalm 50 is the first psalm of Asaph. So a little bit of background. But our title this evening is Myths Stemming from Unthankfulness. Myths that are stemming from unthankfulness. God is concerned with our beliefs. He cares what we believe, because from our beliefs flow our actions and our attitudes. And of course, God is interested in what we do. He's also interested in our attitudes, and those things flow from what we believe. God cares what we believe about him and who he is, and he cares what we believe about, what do we believe about us? What do we believe about who we are? He wants us to believe correctly about those things, because if we believe myths, if we accept myths, if we believe things that are wrong, then that's going to result in not only actions that are wrong and behavior that's wrong, it's also going to result in attitudes that are wrong. And thankfulness is an attitude. It's an attitude that's right. And in Psalm 50 here, the Lord he exposes some myths that are associated with unthankfulness and some of the dangerous things that go along with it. So Psalm 50, and we'll read verses 8 through 21. Psalm 50, verse 8. I will not reprove thee, we'll start in verse 7. Hear, O my people, and I will speak, O Israel, and I will testify against thee. I am God, even thy God. I will not reprove thee for thy sacrifices or thy burnt offerings to have been continually before me. I will take no bullock out of thy house, nor he-goats out of thy folds, for every beast of the forest is mine, and the cattle upon 1,000 hills. And I know all the fowls of the mountains, and the wild beasts of the field are mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell thee, for the world is mine and the fullness thereof. Will I eat the flesh of bulls or drink the blood of goats? Offer unto God thanksgiving, and pay thy vows unto the Most High, and call upon me in the day of trouble. I will deliver thee, and thou shalt glorify me. But unto the wicked God saith, what hast thou to do to declare my statutes, or that thou shouldest take my covenant in thy mouth, seeing thou hatest instruction and castest my words behind thee? When thou sawest a thief, then thou consentest with him, and hast been partaker with adulterers. Thou givest thy mouth to evil, and thy tongue frameth deceit. Thou sittest and speakest against thy brother. Thou slanderest thine own mother's son. These things hast thou done, and I kept silence. Thou thoughtest that I was altogether such an one as thyself. But I will reprove thee, and set them in order before thine eyes. Now consider this, ye that forget God, lest I tear you in pieces, and there be none to deliver. We don't want that. Don't want to be torn in pieces. But number one tonight, as far as these myths that I'll give you, one is this, that God can be bought off. Myths that are associated with unthankfulness. Wrong beliefs, wrong ideas that God links with unthankfulness. Number one is the idea that God can be bought off. The first 6 verses that we read here have to do with those animal sacrifices that God commanded Israel to do. And they were very specific. They were very detailed. And Israel was responsible for obeying every minute instruction given to them. They were supposed to sacrifice the animals, but it was not supposed to be hollow. It was not supposed to be empty. It was not supposed to be heartless. There was supposed to be meaning and depth behind the animals that they sacrificed. And that's what the Lord is rebuking them here for, is getting to the place where they believed a myth and they believed an idea that all we got to do is just give this goat, and that's all God really cares about. He just wants me to give the animal, and that's all that really matters. It was supposed to mean something. There was supposed to be depth to it. In Leviticus, when God gave those instructions, you find the word thanksgiving in the book of Leviticus. The praise offering, the peace offering that was to be given with thanksgiving. The free will offerings given of your own will were to be given with thanksgiving. God cared about the attitude and the heart behind the sacrifice, not just the animal itself. They believed he was only interested in wealth that he could get from them, and that he didn't really care about the heart behind it. Suppose they were right. They believe this myth that it's just about the exterior. It's just about the animal itself. That God he couldn't really see deeply into the heart, in whether or not there was thanks to God from the heart. What would that say about God? It would say, number one, that he's shallow, that he has no depth to him, that he can't see beyond the surface. That's not true. But it would also say that God is poor. It would suggest that God is destitute, that God is desperate, that has so little, that God is so impoverished and so needy, so much so that he's going hungry. And that's what he says in verse 12. He says, if I were hungry, I would not tell thee, for the world is mine and the fullness thereof. The myth that they believed is that God has so little that he'll just be happy if we give him anything. He's so impoverished and has so little. Just toss him a few goats, and he'll be happy just to have whatever he can get. For instance, the homeless panhandler that you drive by on the corner. That panhandler just wants your $50 or your $20 or your $1. He doesn't really care about the affection behind it. He doesn't really care about your thoughts or feelings. He just wants the money because he's needy, and if you wanted, you could express disdain and contempt and insult him greatly, but if you still give him $50, he still views that as a win. So ultimately, he has so little that he's happy just to get whatever he can get, and that's how they were treating God. They were treating God as though he's got nothing and he'll be happy if we just toss him a few animals. And that's what the Lord is responding to. And it's very familiar. How many times have you heard a preacher quote, "The Lord owns the cattle upon 1,000 hills"? But the context of that verse is they're treating God like he's hungry and needy, and he'll just be happy with anything. And his response is, "The earth is mine and the fullness thereof," verse 12. The world is mine. He echoes back to Psalm 24, the earth is mine and the fullness thereof. And what the Lord is saying here is that I'm not poor. I'm not hungry. I'm not desperate. I'm not homeless. I actually own everything. So just tossing me a few animals is not really what I'm after. But just so you know, I don't need your goats that bad. He says that some of the goats across the world, some of the bulls across the world are in your pens, and you're told to sacrifice them to me. But you know what? There's wild animals all over this earth, some that you don't even know what they are. And God says, I own those too. I'm doing all right. I've got plenty. And so really, he says, I'm not really after your goat. What I'm after is not really your bullock. What I'm after is the thanksgiving that's in your heart. I want you to offer me thanks. And the goat and the bull was supposed to be representative of your thanks. If all you give me is the bull and the goat without the thanks, well, I don't really need that bad. What I'm looking for is the heart behind it. And we've got to be careful about that too, because sometimes we can kind of say, well, what? I went to the service. I went to church. What? I wrote the check. What do you want? I read the chapter. I said the prayer. Yeah, but was it a token of true thanks in your heart? Because verse 14 responds to those myths: offer unto God thanksgiving and pay thy vows unto the Most High. He's saying, you do all this, but how about just offering thanksgiving? That's what I was after in the first place. And so we got to be careful about that as well. So that's the first myth. The second one is that commitment is optional. The first myth is that God can be bought off. Like the homeless man, just take this and you're fine. But the second is that commitment is optional. God has made so many promises to us. It's amazing. Some have counted. There's thousands of promises that God has made to man. Exceeding great and precious promises. A great one is in verse 15. Call upon me in the day of trouble. I will deliver thee, and thou shalt glorify me. When you find yourself in trouble, you find yourself in a crisis, God says, I'm asking you to invite me into your trouble. I'm asking you to invoke me so my presence and my power and my deliverance can come into your life, and I can display my delivering power for you. Why? So that I can be glorified. That's the point. That's a great promise among many thousands of other promises. that God has made to us. But in verse 14, he says, offer unto God thanksgiving and pay thy vows unto the Most High. See, God makes so many, every promise is a commitment. When you promise something, you commit to it. And God is not afraid to make promises to us. God is not afraid to make commitments to us. And his desire is that that would not be a one-way street. God's desire is that the promises between us and him are not all one-sided. That's his desire. He talks about vows that he wants us to pay. So we're supposed to make some promises to God too. You can't, I will pay my vows. You can't pay a vow you didn't make. Some of the problems with Christians is a vowless life, a vowless life that's associated with a lack of thanks. To be on the receiving end of thousands of promises, but to never make one in return is to take advantage. It's to prey on the benevolence of God, to trample the benevolence of God. The myth there is that God is a pushover. The myth is that God is a dupe who can be preyed on. God is not a dupe who can be preyed on. To receive promises and promises and promises, never to make one in return is not correct. It's not fair. It's not right. Of course, we'll never make as many promises to God as he has made to us. Of course, we'll never keep as many promises to God as he keeps for us, but we should make some, shouldn't we? We should make some vows. If we're commanded to keep them, that requires making some. One of the reasons that great churches are great churches, and one of the reasons that thriving churches are thriving churches, is because they have people who make vows to God. And there's responsibilities that need to be fulfilled, and there's duties that need to be done. And somewhere along the way, somebody's asked, will you just take care of this? And in order to see that this is done, you got to be dependable and you got to be reliable. And there's people that say, you know what, I'll just make a vow to God that I'll be the one who takes care of that. And those are the churches that really take off and really shake a community, and they really have the sense, the power of God, because there's vows made to God that his promises are being returned to him. And it doesn't happen in places when, hey, this needs to be taken care of. Is there anybody that will do this? How about you? You have the know-how, or you have the whatever it is. And it's always just, I don't really want to be counted on. Maybe once or twice, but don't count on me. I don't want to be relied on. I mean, maybe I'll do it here and there, but I don't want anyone to be, I can't promise anything. And man, so much of the best Christianity flows from promises made to God. The first time I read my Bible all the way through 16 years ago, 17 years ago, is because the man who was discipling me challenged me and said, why don't you just promise God you'll read his word all the way? Not that I was arguing with him, but he said, look, you got to read the whole Bible. You got to know what's in it. And why don't you just make a promise to God? And he said, you know how many promises God has made to you? Why don't you make one to him? You know, there's many people here tonight that you've been married a long time. You've never cheated on your spouse. Why? Because you made a vow. There's many here that maybe used to drink and partake of the things of the world, but you haven't in years or decades. Why? Because you made a promise to God, because you made a vow to God. We've seen that vowing to God is effective and it's blessed. And it's really one of the, if not the greatest key to faithfulness, is making promises to God, making vows to God. It makes a big difference. Now, why does that not happen? And frequently it's because there's a fear. The Bible says it's better to not vow than to vow and not pay. So some people get deathly afraid of the possibility of making a hasty vow and then not paying it. But to let the fear of potentially in the future maybe reneging on it keep you from ever making a vow at all is really just as bad. I mean, what's worse, to make vows that aren't kept or to never make a vow at all? Really, they're both bad. Neither one is a good option. So just the command not to break a vow. There's also a responsibility to make vows. Thankfulness. This psalm tells us that it is thankfulness that leads to making vows. And the man who is afraid to make any kind of a vow to God is a man who's grossly lacking thanks in his heart to God, because Psalm 14 associates those things. When there's thanksgiving, there's vows made, and there's the keeping of those vows. And when we vow and break, our vow is broken because thankfulness is lacking. And then lastly, the last myth to debunk is this: God is just like us. God is just like us. See, the one to whom we, in verse 14, the one to whom we give thanks The one to whom we pay our vows is the Most High. He's the Most High. 50 times God uses that title for himself, the Most High. Psalm 92, it is a good thing to give thanks unto the Lord and to sing praises unto thy name, O Most High. He's the Most High. Isaiah tells us to rejoice in his highness. Isaiah also tells us that his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. Isaiah tells us that even Lucifer wants to be like the Most High. The book of Ephesians, chapter 1, tells us that Christ is far above all principality and power. Hebrews 7 tells us that Christ is made higher than the heavens. And one of the reasons why thankfulness is so important is because thankfulness keeps him lifted up. Thankfulness in our hearts exalts him and keeps him in his place of highness in our lives. It keeps us from bringing him down to our level. And in this passage that we read, we find that thieves steal and adulterers cheat and slanderers slander because they bring God down to their level. Verse 21 says, to them, God was altogether such an one as they are. God's just like me. Verse 21, these things thou hast done. So he listed all those sins. These things thou hast done, and I kept silence. Thou thoughtest that I was altogether such an one as thyself. That's the Lord speaking. They believe the myth that God is just like them. But God is not a man that he should lie. And he's high, and yes, he came down. Manna from heaven came down. Christ came down from high to earth. Praise the Lord. He made himself, he took upon him the form of a servant. He was lowly. He was willing to be treated lowly. Yes, he inhabits a body just like ours. Christ has stepped into human flesh. Yes, all those things are true, but the book of Hebrews tells us, yeah, but he was still holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners. And in much popular Christian literature and many mega churches and the modern Bible versions present Christ as your drinking buddy. Just one of the good old boys. And just a buddy. And praise the Lord, he's called me not just a servant, but a friend. I do get to call him a friend. But even though Christ is my friend, he is tempted in all points and yet without sin. He is still holy. Even though he's my friend, he is still holy. And that's part of his being lifted up is thanksgiving associated with his holiness. Is there a place in the Bible where my giving of thanks is associated with his holiness? Yes, there is. Twice. We're told to give thanks at the remembrance of his holiness. Thanksgiving and his holiness go together. And Psalm 50 explains to us here that bringing God down to our level is how carnal man justifies joining the adulterers and joining the thieves and joining the slanderers. And why is that? Because it's this thought process. The myth of this thought process. God is just like me. He's my buddy. Therefore, we're equals. We're equals, and if we're equals, then he thinks the way I think. And if he thinks the way I think, then whatever I do, he would do too. And so whatever I do, he's okay with me doing. They're bringing God down to their level. Our problem is that too often God's the Most High, and we want him to be the Most High when we've got verse 15. I've got trouble. I've got crisis. I want the Most High. I want deliverance. I want power. I want the Most High on my side. But when it comes to our standards of purity and our standards of holiness and our holiness in our living and our holiness in our conduct, then I don't really want it to be the Most High. Maybe kind of high, maybe up there somewhere, but not really the Most High. And the truth is, if he's the Most High in deliverance and power, he's still the Most High in holiness, and he's still the Most High in expectations. And he still says, be ye holy, for I am holy. And this psalm shows that the lowering of God coincides with unthankfulness. And if the lowering of God coincides with unthankfulness, then one of the things that staying helpful will cause us to do is to continue to lift him up. Stay thankful. Keep that thankfulness to God in your heart. That keeps him lifted up in his highness where he deserves to be. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for all that we've, Lord, had the opportunity to be blessed by this evening. We hope that it blesses your name. It was all for you. Lord, I pray that you'd help us to Have all of our actions for you filled with substance and with depth and meaning behind them and not shallow. Lord, help us to be willing to make vows to you. Lord, whether it's about church attendance, whether it's about tithing, whether it's about reading our Bibles, witnessing, the many thousands of things that you tell us to do, Lord, may we be willing to make promises to you. And Lord, help us to exalt you always. And Lord, show us when our thankfulness is slipping. Show us when we're beginning to denigrate the holiness of God. Help us to truly give thanks at the remembrance of thy holiness. In Jesus' precious